Imagine becoming the most powerful person on earth, only to discover that the man you replaced had sabotaged you from the grave. This is the story of a silent war fought in whispers, where a president's name became forbidden, and the truth stayed buried for decades. Asterisk May 7, 1945. The entire world is celebrating. Nazi Germany has fallen. Victory in Europe. Champagne flows through the streets of London, Paris, New York. Soldiers kiss strangers. Confetti rains from skyscrapers. Church bells ring for hours, but inside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, something bizarre is unfolding. The new American president calls an urgent meeting. His face is stone. His eyes burn with something his staff has never seen before, not exhaustion, not stress, rage, pure, white-hot rage. And then he says something that freezes everyone in place, effective immediately. There's a name I don't want spoken in this building. Not in my office. Not in the hallways. Not in the cafeteria. Do I make myself clear? His press secretary, a childhood friend who's known him for 40 years, carefully asks, "Which name, sir?" The president's jaw muscles tighten so hard they look like steel cables. You know exactly which name: Roosevelt, Franklin, FDR, any variation. Unless it's absolutely critical for official government business, I don't want to hear it. Spread the word quietly. Asterisk, think about what this means. The most famous president in modern American history, a man who'd led the nation for 12 years, who'd pulled America out of the Great Depression, who'd guided the Allied victory in World War II, his name was now essentially banned from the White House. Not officially, of course. There was no executive order, no formal policy. But everyone understood. Mentioning Roosevelt around President Harry Truman was career suicide. Within days, the entire West Wing learned to communicate in code. They said, the previous administration or prior policy decisions, or just let awkward silences hang in the air where Roosevelt's name should have been. New employees received quiet warnings from veterans. Whatever you do, don't bring up Roosevelt unless you want to watch the president's face turn purple. But here's the question that should haunt you. What could possibly make a sitting president so furious that he can't even hear his predecessor's name? What happened between these two men? Because this wasn't just political disagreement. This wasn't policy differences. This was something deeper, darker, more personal. This was betrayal. Asterisk. Let me take you back to May 6, 1945, the day before victory in Europe. Harry Truman had been president for exactly 24 days. 20-4 days. Less than a month to learn a job that normally takes years to master. And what a month it had been. He was drowning in decisions that would shape the next 50 years of human history. How to end the war with Japan, how to manage the increasingly hostile relationship with Stalin, how to handle something called the Manhattan Project, which he'd only learned about. After becoming president, he was working 18-hour days, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, living on black coffee and pure adrenaline. His hands shook from exhaustion. His eyes were bloodshot. His staff worried he might collapse, and everywhere people kept telling him what Roosevelt would have done. Mr. President. When President Roosevelt handled this situation, Sir, the Roosevelt approach was ... FDR always said ... It was like being haunted by a ghost who refused to leave. That afternoon of May 6th, Truman sat in a cabinet meeting about post-war economic policy. Henry Morgenthau Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary was presenting his plan for defeated Germany. The Morgenthau plan called for completely destroying Germany's industrial capacity. Turn it into a nation of farmers. Strip it of all factories, all manufacturing, all potential to ever wage war again. Roosevelt had tentatively approved it. And Morgenthau kept invoking Roosevelt's memory like a weapon. President Roosevelt understood that Germany must be punished. Severely. President Roosevelt agreed with me that half measures wouldn't work. President Roosevelt wanted Truman exploded. President Roosevelt is dead. The room went silent. You could hear people's breathing. Morgenthau looked like he'd been slapped. Truman continued, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. President Roosevelt has been dead for nearly a month. I am the president now. And I think your plan is absolutely insane. It would create 50 million starving Germans who'd become easy targets for communist propaganda. It would destabilize all of Europe. So no, we're not doing it. This meeting is over. He stood up and walked out, left Morgenthau sitting there, humiliated in front of the entire cabinet. But that confrontation? That public explosion? That was just the beginning. What happened later that night revealed the real reason for Truman's rage. And trust me, you're not ready for this. 8 p.m. May 6, 1945. Charlie Ross, Truman's press secretary and lifelong friend, walks into the Oval Office. The lights are off. In the darkness, he can barely make out the president's silhouette. Truman is sitting at Roosevelt's old desk, now his desk, with a glass of bourbon in his hand. Ross flips on a light. Truman looks destroyed. Not tired, destroyed. Like something fundamental has broken inside him. Charlie, Truman says quietly, do you want to know what I found today? In Roosevelt's desk? He pulls out a manila folder and throws it across the desk. Ross picks it up, starts reading, and what he reads makes his blood run cold. It was a memorandum written by Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself, dated February 1945, 2 months before his death. The title, Concerns Regarding the Vice President. Roosevelt had documented, in writing, his doubts about Harry Truman's ability to be president. Let me read you some of what he wrote. Vice President Truman is, at his core, a small-minded machine politician from Missouri. He lacks the intellectual capacity and global vision required for leadership at this level. His understanding of foreign affairs is rudimentary at best. But it gets worse. Roosevelt suggested that perhaps the Democratic Party should consider replacing Truman on the ticket in 1948 if Roosevelt survived his fourth term. And if Roosevelt didn't survive? The memo recommended that the cabinet should provide extensive guidance and oversight to ensure Truman didn't make catastrophic mistakes. In other words, babysit him. Treat him like a child who can't be trusted with sharp objects. But there was more. So much more. Over the previous 3 weeks, Truman had been going through Roosevelt's files, and he kept discovering secret after secret after secret correspondence between Roosevelt and Stalin, where FDR had made commitments about post-war Eastern Europe that went far beyond what the American public knew. Roosevelt had essentially given Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria to Soviet control, just handed them over in exchange for Stalin's promise to help fight Japan. Truman was now stuck with these secret deals he'd never been consulted about, deals he fundamentally disagreed with, but he couldn't publicly disavow them without looking like he was abandoning American commitments. He found notes showing Roosevelt had told his advisors, don't brief Truman on sensitive matters. He doesn't need to know yet. Yet, as if Truman was a child who'd be told the truth when he was older, Roosevelt had systematically excluded Truman from everything important, cabinet meetings, Truman rarely invited, diplomatic negotiations, kept away, military briefings, not necessary. The Manhattan Project, the secret development of atomic weapons, nobody even told Truman it existed until a FDR he became president. Think about that. The vice president of the United States during wartime wasn't told that America was building a weapon that could destroy entire cities. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. In those 82 days, he'd met alone with Roosevelt exactly twice. Total conversation time? Maybe 30 minutes. That wasn't accidental. That wasn't Roosevelt being busy. That was intentional isolation. And here's the part that hurt Truman most of all. Roosevelt had never wanted him as vice president in the first place. The Democratic Party bosses had forced Truman onto the 1944 ticket because Roosevelt's previous VP, Henry Wallace, was considered too left-wing and controversial. Roosevelt resented being told who his running mate would be, and he took out that resentment by treating Truman like he didn't exist. Asterisk. So now you understand, Truman wasn't just angry about policy, disagreements. He wasn't just frustrated about being unprepared. He had discovered that Franklin Roosevelt, the man the entire world worshipped, had treated him with complete contempt, had called him small-minded and stupid. Had deliberately kept him ignorant, had sabotaged his ability to succeed. And now everyone expected Truman to honor Roosevelt's legacy. Charlie Ross asked the obvious question that night. Why don't you just tell people the truth? Why not explain how Roosevelt treated you? Truman's answer revealed his impossible situation. Because I can't. The country needs to believe in Roosevelt right now. The war with Japan isn't over. Our alliance with Britain and the Soviets is fragile. If I start attacking Roosevelt's memory, I look petty and weak. The press would crucify me. So I have to smile and pretend I'm honored to continue his legacy, while privately cleaning up his mess. The next day, Victory in Europe Day, Truman had to give a national address. Everyone expected him to praise Roosevelt, to give him credit for leading America to victory. Truman's speechwriters had written beautiful, elaborate tributes to FDR. Truman cut all of it. His final speech mentioned Roosevelt exactly once. President Roosevelt did not live to see this day, but we know he shares in our victory. One sentence. That's all Roosevelt got. Newspapers noticed. Some criticized Truman for not showing proper respect to his predecessor. On such a historic day, that's when Truman gave the order. The informal ban on Roosevelt's name. He couldn't publicly attack Roosevelt without destroying himself politically, but he also couldn't stand hearing constant comparisons. Being told he wasn't measuring up to a man who deliberately set him up to fail. So he created a bubble, a space where Roosevelt's ghost couldn't reach him. For 6 months, White House staff learned to navigate this strange prohibition. They developed elaborate euphemisms. Previous policy instead of Roosevelt's policy. Prior decisions instead of what FDR decided. Awkward pauses where his name should have been. It created bizarre situations. Eleanor Roosevelt would occasionally visit to collect personal items. Staff would warn each other, Mrs. Roosevelt is coming today. Be careful. Not because Eleanor was difficult, but because her presence made it almost impossible to avoid mentioning her husband. One young State Department aide made the mistake of saying during a briefing, Mr. President, at Yalta, President Roosevelt agreed to. Truman cut him off. I've read the Yalta agreements. Just tell me what the Soviets want now. The aide tried again. Sir, they're citing President Roosevelt's commitment to Truman stood up. Are you DEAF? I said, tell me what they want now, not what Roosevelt promised them. The aide left shaken. Word spread. Mentioning Roosevelt to Truman was career suicide. Asterisk. The ban lasted 6 months, from May through October 1945. What changed? Truman proved himself. He authorized the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war with Japan. He took a firm stand against Soviet expansion at the Potsdam Conference. He established his own identity as president, separate from Roosevelt's shadow. He didn't need to avoid Roosevelt's name anymore, because he wasn't being compared to Roosevelt constantly. He was being judged on his own merits. In late October 1945, at a Democratic Party event, Truman publicly praised Roosevelt for the first time in months. President Roosevelt built the foundation of victory. We are harvesting what he planted. The ban was over, but Truman never forgave Roosevelt. Not really. In 1960, giving interviews for a book about his presidency, Truman was asked directly, "Did you admire President Roosevelt?" He paused for a long time, then said, "I admired what he accomplished for the country. I did not admire how he treated people who worked for him. He could be cruel in casual ways, dismissive of people he thought beneath him. I was one of those people." He made that very clear. So no, I didn't admire him personally, but I respected what he did for America, even when I disagreed with how he did it. By the time Truman left office in 1953, he had established his own legacy, integrated the armed forces, stood up to Soviet expansion, rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, recognized Israel, established a NATO. He was no longer just Roosevelt's successor. He was Harry Truman, the president who made the tough calls Roosevelt avoided. 6-month ban on Roosevelt's name remains one of the Todd's strangest episodes in White House history, but it wasn't petty. It was survival. Sometimes the most powerful person in the world needs permission to be angry. Truman gave himself that permission, in the only way he could without destroying his presidency. Banned a name for 6 months, not because he was small-minded, but because he was human. And sometimes being human means admitting you're furious at someone who treated you like you didn't matter, even if that someone is considered one of the greatest presidents in American history.